2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, hello and welcome. Thank you for attending today's webinar, DevOps is More Than Automation. Before we begin, I'd like to cover just a few items regarding the platform. At the bottom of your screen, you'll notice a handful of widgets, mainly Q&A, which you can utilize to submit any questions you have throughout the session. For viewing purposes, you can also expand your viewing window by clicking on the icon found in the top right corner of your slide viewer. If you have technical difficulties, click on the Help widget. And lastly, take a moment to fill out the survey at the end of the webinar. Thanks. And at this time, I'll turn it over to your presenter, Tony Lunt.
Thank you so much, Taylor. I appreciate that. Thank you so much to everybody for attending today. Today's presentation is called DevOps is More Than Automation. This presentation is going to be a little bit different thematically than some of the other DevOps presentations you might have seen. So instead of being technology specific, we're going to be investigating the relationship between DevOps and Agile. And particularly, I'm very interested in how we talk about DevOps and DevOps transformations. So DevOps transformations are often rooted in conversations more so than technology, specifically towards the beginning. So for that reason, I think it's good to think about how we position ourselves as Agilist and DevOps professionals before we get too in the weeds with architecting our DevOps strategies. So that's going to be a little bit of what we're talking about today. So to kick things off, I'd like to very briefly introduce myself. My name is Tony Lunt. I am an architect with Insight's Modern Apps practice. I have a background as a full stack developer. Over the last few years, I've kind of found my niche as being a DevOps evangelist. I'm very enthusiastic about all things DevOps and Agile. I also carry a professional Scrum Master certification. So I love to kind of geek out about this type of Agile stuff and whenever I can. So I really appreciate everybody coming out today. And then very briefly, I also want to give an opportunity for Angela Brown to introduce herself, as she'll be here helping to facilitate and provide her wisdom as well.
Hi all, I'm Angela Brown. I've been with Insight for a little over 7 years. I focus on transformation services within our digital innovations group, primarily Agile practices, business analysis, project management, those types of opportunities to help serve our clients.
Great, thank you so much, Angela. And Angela is kind enough to help monitor the Q&A as well. So as you have questions, please feel free to drop them there. And we'll either interject if there's a good time to do that, or at the very end of the session, at least we will also have some time for open questions or commentary of any kind. I want to be mindful of everybody's time today. I know we did block off an hour for this. My hope is to get you all out of here well in advance of that. So I'm not a fan of adding too much fluff for presentations just for length's sake. So I will try to get through the material in a timely manner and give us plenty of time for questions or anything else that comes up. So just to kind of start setting the roadmap for where we're going to be going today, there's going to be 4 specific areas that we're going to drill into. So we're going to start off with a very basic definition of what we mean when we say DevOps and some of the things that are around that, some of the characteristics of DevOps. Then we're going to shift into talking about those DevOps conversations and some of the types of transformational conversations we can find ourselves in and some better ways that we can position ourselves when we're having those conversations. Then we'll dive into DevOps values, particularly as those pertain to Agile values, and we'll be kind of examining the relationship between DevOps and Agile a little bit more deeply than we might have otherwise. And then finally, we're going to close out with talking a little bit more about everything we've already discussed and how that applies in practice. So what are some of the practical things we can do as DevOps professionals or Agilists or whatever roles we're in to help position our teams and our organizations for success. So to kick things off, what is DevOps? So no DevOps presentation would be complete without some sort of ham-fisted attempt to define it. And that's for a good reason. It's a term that's been out there in the wild for over 10 years now, and there is still vigorous debate in the industry around what DevOps even means. And so for that reason, it makes it very hard when we start talking about DevOps transformations, or DevOps engineering, or DevOps automation. There's all these DevOps related terms that are floating out there in the ether, and if we don't have a good solid definition of DevOps itself, it starts to lose its value as we start to actually implement these kind of things within our organizations and our teams. So I would not be arrogant enough to assume that I'm going to be the end-all, be-all definer of what DevOps means. So I'm going to take the somewhat simple track of using a definition from Microsoft's Donovan Brown. He is a very deep thinker about all things DevOps, and this is one that you'll see used quite a bit, particularly within Insight as we talk about DevOps in other venues. So DevOps is the union of people, process, and products to enable continuous delivery of value to our end users. I love this definition of DevOps for a lot of reasons. First off, because it doesn't call out any sort of specific technologies, and it doesn't identify any specific requirements when we're talking about DevOps. It simply describes a culture, right? It's about bringing our people together and empowering them with the resources at our disposal to help deliver value better. That's something everybody wants to do. So you'd be hard pressed to find an organization that would not want to pursue this kind of mentality. So we're not excluding anybody with this definition, and we're not getting so specific that we're getting out over our skis with anything. So I think this type of definition, even if this isn't the one that your organization lands on, is the kind of thing you should be looking for. You should be looking for something that's unifying, but general enough that it can be applied in a lot of circumstances and can apply to everybody in your organization and every team within your organization. So now that we've talked about what DevOps is in very general terms, let's talk a little bit about what DevOps is not, right? Because as we'll find as we kind of get into a lot more of these conversations around DevOps and DevOps transformations and DevOps engineers, that there are a lot of ways that DevOps is misused or maybe just misunderstood. And there's a lot of anti-patterns around how we approach DevOps. So without being too negative, I do want to take a few slides to kind of talk through some of the kind of things we can look out for when we're defining DevOps and what it means to us as professionals and teams and organizations. So first off, DevOps is not a destination, right? There's no magical end state when you can say that we do DevOps or we have achieved DevOps. It's just simply a culture of commitment to always trying to be better, to always trying to bring your people together and use your resources better to deliver value in a more streamlined fashion in a way that it delights your users and your customers and your clients. So that's something that's very important to think about, and we'll get into this more as we get into kind of the DevOps conversation section. But it's always good to kind of check yourself when you're talking about DevOps and making sure that you're not saying that we do DevOps and they don't, because that's just not how DevOps works. It's not what it is fundamentally. DevOps is not a defined standard. So kind of along those same lines, right? DevOps doesn't have, some official industry checklist that anybody could just check off and say, okay, we've achieved DevOps. There's no industry committee that's determining what counts as DevOps and what doesn't. So it's good to keep that in mind, that DevOps is going to mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and that's okay. And we're gonna drill into that more. But I just want to set that expectation up front that I'm not going to be presenting any secret recipe for DevOps here. I'm not going to be giving any checklist or anything that you need to achieve in order to say that you've accomplished a DevOps culture. Next, DevOps is not for sale. That might sound funny for a technology services company to say in a public fashion, but you cannot exchange money evenly to receive DevOps. DevOps is a culture, it is a commitment. You can certainly make investments in DevOps and build and investments in your people, investments in your tools, investment in your processes. These are all things that are very worthwhile to invest in, and there probably will be a financial cost to pursuing DevOps as a culture and as a concept, but there's not an even exchange there. There's quite a bit of cultural work that has to be done and a lot of personal transformation that has to be done amongst the people that make up teams and organizations in order for a successful DevOps culture to be present. So now that we've kind of laid the groundwork for defining what DevOps is not, let's start to talk a little bit about these DevOps conversations. Like I said, DevOps transformations, a lot of times when you hear that, you imagine vast tools being orchestrated, massive changes to CI/CD pipelines, changes to how we package and deploy our applications, how we monitor things, and how that informs our backlogs. Those are all very valid and valuable parts of what we do, and that's very important, so I'm not downplaying that at all. But at the beginning, a lot of times it just looks like a lot of conversations over and over with a lot of different people, a lot of different stakeholders. And so that's why it's so important to be able to look at these things accurately and make sure that we're having fruitful conversations so that we're not retreading the same ground or leading ourselves in a bad direction. So this is a section that I like to call, what we talk about when we talk about DevOps. So I've been in a lot of these conversations over the years, and it's interesting how a lot of times it feels like history repeats itself. And I think a lot of people can attest to that. It feels like every organization feels unique and is unique, but a lot of times we're facing similar challenges. So a lot of times conversations will go the same way across multiple teams and organizations. So preparing ourselves for those situations to be able to react in a healthy way and in a way that brings people together and helps move the conversation forward so that we're not just rehashing the same conversation over and over is going to be a very valuable tool for anybody who's part of this environment. So we're going to look over these next few slides at a few different anti-patterns around these conversations that happen commonly. The first one is going to be, when we talk about DevOps, we focus more on trending technologies and less on the problems they solve. And, that's an easy thing to do. And that's something that I have to check myself on all the time. As technologists, we love to geek out over the latest and greatest thing. I'm a developer at heart, so I love to just talk code and talk about different things that are coming out on the market that we could be using. And that's all well and good. You need people with that kind of passion within your organization. But the challenge is to first look at the uniqueness of the environment that you're in and let that inform what tools you actually need. So you couldn't throw a rock online in DevOps circles without running into lots of conversations around things like Kubernetes. And Kubernetes is awesome. I mean, if you're writing a lot of containerized applications and microservices, you're going to be hard pressed to find a better way to orchestrate those. But the problem is nobody's business objective is to use Kubernetes, right? Nobody's business objective is to go to the cloud even, or at least it shouldn't be. The business objective should be something about the unique value that the organization is delivering, and that should then come back and inform us as to what technologies we need. I'm very enthusiastic about things like Kubernetes, but I'm not doing anybody any favors if I just go into a new organization or a new team and say, hi, I'm here to deliver Kubernetes. That's not a healthy way to approach any problem. We can't, hang our hat on a specific hammer and go looking for nails, right? It's about understanding the problem in front of us and letting that inform what steps we take. Next up, when we talk about DevOps, we guilt teams for not deploying as often as the world's largest tech companies. So if you have attended other DevOps presentations, you've probably seen slides where we show companies like Netflix or Amazon, and we talk about how they deploy to production a million times a day, quite literally. It's impressive, and that, it's worth respecting that, and that's great, and maybe that is the end goal of your organization. But focusing on that and guilting people for not deploying as often as they should is not going to open up a dialogue that's going to bring people in and make them feel included in the organization. And remember that DevOps, like we said before, is about unifying people. with all the resources at our disposal to be able to perform at their best and deliver value in the best way possible. So if we start the conversation by guilting people for what they're not doing, then we're not really doing ourselves any favors. And at the end of the day, even focusing on millions of production deployments a day probably isn't going to solve the problems that an organization needs. Even just getting to one production deployment a day without any ceremony or manual processes is probably going to solve 95% of the technological problems that a team has. That's a generalization, but overall, if you can get to some kind of regular cadence of production deployments that happen automatically, then you're probably in a much better state than many of your competitors, or at the very least, you're keeping up. So I always hesitate to even mention companies like Netflix or Amazon when I'm helping to build out DevOps transformations, because a lot of times it's just setting this high watermark that doesn't actually provide any real value. So that's just something to be aware of. To kind of drive this point home, Atlassian, every year they do a survey of organizations to kind of understand where they're at in their DevOps journey and how things are going internally within their organization. And so not surprisingly, at least to me, 99% of respondents report that DevOps has had a positive effect on their organization. That's not surprising. If you look around the industry, everybody's very enthusiastic about DevOps. So it stands to reason that most organizations would at least say that DevOps is beneficial to them. What did surprise me was that 49% report that it increased their deployment frequency, or I should say only 49%. Because when we talk about DevOps, a lot of times we're so hyper-focused on the deployment frequency, which is a very valid metric, and it's a good thing to be tracking, and it's a good thing to be increasing. But at least half of the companies that are finding benefits in pursuing DevOps haven't even seen that increase in their deployment frequency yet, but they're still finding value in DevOps. So there's something else happening there that is providing value and is still giving a little bit of magic to an organization. So that's something that is good to keep in mind. Don't get hyper-focused on this idea of frequent automated production deployments to the point where you're ignoring everything else about the organization, because you might be losing the forest for the trees at that point. And then finally, when we talk about DevOps, our language is often condescending and exclusive. So this is kind of a simpler way of saying what I said over the past 2 points there. But you'll hear a lot of people saying that we do DevOps and they don't, or our organization will never be able to do DevOps, or their organization will never be able to do DevOps. It's not always just condescending to other people. It's condescending to ourselves, where we'll take the easy route and say, we don't need to pursue this as an organization because we're just not there. We're never going to have that kind of maturity to be able to achieve this. And that's a shame, because as we've already seen, DevOps is not some end state. It's not a prescribed recipe for what you need to do. It's something that everybody can do to always be looking at ways to increase their value and make their people happier, because they're delivering value more frequently. So that's just a good thing to be aware of, and to be thinking about how we position ourselves with the organizations. DevOps should be inviting people in and be building a platform for everybody to contribute and feel like they're achieving their best. And it should not be something that's building silos within the industry even, but definitely not within our organizations or within our teams. So that's just a good thing to keep in mind as you're approaching your organization. So, what does a DevOps engineer do? That is a very valid question, and there is a lot of debate in the industry around that, right? So, about DevOps, we've talked a lot about the conversations around it, and it's become pretty clear that DevOps is a pretty broad term and can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. But there is this job title floating out there in the wild of DevOps engineer. So what does a DevOps engineer do? What do? I consider myself a DevOps engineer, but it's still this wide open question of what, at the end of the day, does a DevOps engineer do? So we do have a poll question here. Please feel free to complete this. It's what skills would your organization expect of a DevOps engineer? And that would be, we'd really appreciate getting your feedback there. Angela, I don't know if we're going to, I was watching your messages. I don't know if we'll be seeing the responses live here. But if anybody has any thoughts they'd like to provide at this point, please feel free to put them into the Q&A and we'll read those out. One second, I'm going to take a quick water break while y'all are filling that out. And this is not a gotcha question, so we're not going to shame you. There is no right or wrong answer to this. This is simply us just trying to get a feel for what kind of things different organizations are expecting of DevOps engineers, because it is such a broad question. So any participation is definitely appreciated. And I will, Angela, you can give me a thumbs up if I should just go on to the next slide or not at this point if you want me to hang out.
Yeah, I think we're good to proceed. We may be seeing some of those results, which we can share out if we have them during the presentation.
Okay, great. That'll be awesome. And and like I said, there'll be plenty of time at the end of this for some Q&A as well, so we can revisit that. But to help answer this question myself, as I was kind of collecting my thoughts for this presentation, I did go out, I just scanned, the first 20 or 30 job postings for DevOps engineer out on Indeed, because it seemed like, a great way to just get a pulse for what are DevOps engineers really doing. So I came up with this very brief list. These are all distinct skills that are out there on job postings for DevOps engineers right now. So you can see there are some companies that want their DevOps engineers to be VB.NET developers. Some of them expect them to understand networking or security, and obviously all the usual suspects when we think of DevOps, like infrastructure as code and Agile and that kind of thing. But it's a wide range. These are not all from one job posting, but it's from, several from large companies within my area. So this seems like a exaggerated example, I know, but the fact of the matter is these are real skills that somebody is expecting a DevOps engineer to do in some capacity. So for that reason, the point I'm trying to make is that no two DevOps engineer roles will match. And that's for good reason, as we just saw. There's all these things that we want DevOps engineers to do in different times. So sometimes you need somebody who's just a really sharp developer and geeks out about code and all of that, maybe more passionate about the delivery of the application and building out CI/CD pipelines and that kind of thing. Sometimes you might need somebody who's more of an infrastructure person who can understand how to sling subnets and set up firewalls and all that kind of thing. Sometimes you might need somebody who's a little more security oriented or more of a sysadmin. It could be anything, and there's really no wrong answer. So that kind of is part of the reason why DevOps engineering is such a controversial, I'll say, job title. There's a valid argument to be made at that point that we should not be deigning one person as being a DevOps engineer when it's more dependent upon the team and the organization that they're in. But at the end of the day, DevOps engineer is out there in the wild, just like DevOps. It's not going anywhere. It's going to be in the industry. So it's going to be something we're going to have to grapple with, for better or for worse. But the one thing that all of those DevOps engineer job postings had in common was that they expect you to understand Agile, because DevOps was born out of Agile. And whether you acknowledge it as an Agile skill or not, the things that a DevOps engineer will be doing are going to be rooted in Agile flavored concepts about trying to deliver value more seamlessly and bringing people together. So the pursuit of a DevOps culture is also the pursuit of an Agile culture. So as DevOps engineers, we can't be looking at Agile as somebody else's job. We can't say that's just something the Scrum Master does, or that's just something the product owner does, or that's just something for the people who manage our Kanban board. That's something that we need to be bought into and have some good religion around, and actually be thinking about as we're planning out our work and approaching our organizations. If you're not bought into Agile, but you are bought into DevOps, it might be time to take a step back and kind of think a little bit more about what it is you're actually trying to accomplish. It might be that you want to have X technology in your organization, and that's fine. But that might not necessarily be the pursuit of DevOps. That might be the pursuit of a specific technology, which is fine. But we just want to level the playing field, acknowledge what DevOps is and what DevOps isn't, and what it definitely is a pursuit of Agile and an Agile culture. So we've talked a lot about how DevOps engineers need to be accommodating to the needs of the organization and need to be able to have the skills that organization needs, not necessarily the skills that they think a DevOps engineer should have. We've talked a little bit about the conversations that we can have around DevOps and how those can be more fruitful. But at the end of the day, if we were to boil that down, we need to be able to mentor teams where they are and not lecture them about where they're not. That's what this kind of boils down to, is as a DevOps engineer, if I'm stepping into a new team and a new organization, I'm not coming there to introduce a specific technology. I'm not coming there to set high watermarks for what a deployment frequency should be. I'm coming in there to meet them where they are and help them figure out the iterative steps to get to where they want to be. It's all about inspecting where we're at and evolving from there. So at this point, since we've acknowledged that, we're going to start to dig a little bit more into the Agile side, right? So DevOps and Agile have this kind of history where DevOps was born out of Agile, and they've kind of iterated together over the years, and the concepts around those have always had these shared values. And DevOps is commonly attributed to coming out of a session on Agile infrastructure in 2008 at an Agile conference. And interestingly enough, the story is that there was a session on Agile infrastructure that only 2 people attended. And those 2 people in turn started to build out an online community around this stuff. And it led to a series of conferences called DevOps Days and things like that. And that's how the term DevOps was born. The reason I share this is not to give you a history lesson, but just to drive home the point that DevOps is truly born out of Agile, quite literally in that sense. And it's kind of this idea of taking, we understood that Agile principles worked really well for software development, and that we could apply the principles in that way pretty easily, or not easily, but we at least saw the benefits of it pretty easily. And we wanted to figure out how we could take infrastructure work and position it the same way. That's not to say that DevOps is strictly an infrastructure skill, because it's not, but it's about bringing this idea of infrastructure together with the idea of development onto kind of a shared cadence and a shared consensus about how we want to handle deploying value out to our users. So let's start to dig in a little bit into these Agile values that are shared with DevOps. So the 4 core Agile values from the Agile Manifesto, a lot of you have probably seen these before. Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. Working software over comprehensive documentation. Customer collaboration over contract negotiation. And responding to change over following a plan. That's not to say that the things on the left side are the things we value more than the things on the right, but the things on the right are still very important for any organization. And DevOps ties in so well with all of these things. These are all things that we value in DevOps, being able to respond to changes quickly, having that good feedback loop for how things are going out there in our production environments, and having that inform our backlogs for what we want to tackle next in our work. We value getting that feedback from our customers and having working software out there. We don't necessarily value taking time to do manual documentation as much, although that's still very important. But the one that we often lose when we're talking about DevOps is the very first one, right? Individuals and interactions over processes and tools. like I've said before, a lot of times we like to think about specific technologies. We like to think about specific ideas, and a lot less around the people and the conversations that we have with those people. So that's something that I'm very passionate about in organizations, is trying to help us understand the people that make up our teams and the teams that make up our organizations, because that's actually what DevOps is built on. If we go back to that initial definition we set out at the beginning, that it's the union of people, processes, and tools, or products, I should say. And it's that people part that we often lose as technologists. You know, we love to geek out over code and technology and orchestration and all these things, but we don't think about the human element of it as much as DevOps professionals. I think Agile has built, like the Agile culture and the people that come up in that, who are, you know, professional Scrum Masters by trade and product owners, they've done a very good job of thinking about that, but I don't think that has yet translated down to the dev side as well as it could. So that's something I'm really passionate about trying to push for whenever I can. Another shared value is empiricism. So that's a fancy word. You might have also heard of it as plan, do, check, act. But it's a very simple concept at the end of the day. It's the idea that we observe the results of our actions and we adjust accordingly. That sounds like the most obvious thing in the world to do, but it's surprisingly not sometimes for any of us. You know, it's very easy to have this idea in our head of, this is what our team should look like. This is what our production environment should look like. This is how our organization should act. And we get so caught up on that, and we keep pressing forward on that and hammering against that sprint after sprint, and we keep failing. And the reason for that is because we forgot about empiricism. We forgot to actually stop and inspect how things are going and adjust accordingly. And that's what DevOps is all about. You know, if a lot of times we'll use a figure-8 chart to show DevOps. I kind of left it off of here because sometimes it takes too much time to go into, and we kind of lose the point of it by inspecting it too much. But the idea is that we have this constant feedback loop of deploying some value to users, looking at how it's going out there after it's been delivered, letting that inform what we do next. So it's about being very nimble, avoiding using the overloaded term agile there, but it's about being able to react accordingly as things change in our environments. And that's often a lot more challenging than it seems. But if we keep it in the front of our heads during conversations around DevOps, and as we're actually executing as a team, we can often find ourselves in a much better place than we would otherwise. All right, so we've talked a lot about DevOps, defining it. We've talked about the conversations that we have around DevOps, and we've talked about some of the shared values between Agile and DevOps. To close out, let's look at what this might appear as in practice, or how it might look in practice for us. So there's a few things that I think a DevOps engineer can do to be valuable in an Agile sense and to execute as efficiently as possible. The first thing is being able to understand the organization. And by that, I mean not just understanding that you're in an organization, you're trying to execute, you know, IT type things. You understand the context that you're in. You understand what makes that organization tick. So I like to think about, you know, what's the secret sauce of the organization? What's the unique value that the organization provides, and what's contributed to past successes? You know, if we got to this point as an organization, we probably did at least something right. We're probably providing some sort of unique value, or at least a good value in relation to our competitors if we have them. So it's contingent on us. The onus is on us as DevOps professionals, as developers, as Scrum Masters and product owners, to understand that value, understand what the organization is delivering and how we want to improve upon that, and what are some of the things that have contributed to our past successes. So it doesn't do us any good to always be looking at the past as a failure. That's an easy thing to do in an organization, to just constantly be kind of in this negative mindset about everything that's come before us. But let's be honest with ourselves. What are some of the good things that have happened? What are some of the things that we've done that have worked really well for us? And let's make sure that as we take next steps, we're not doing anything to harm those things unnecessarily. You know, the inverse of that same conversation is, what are the impediments to the organization? Like, what's actually stopping us from delivering more value on a frequent basis? And, you know, everybody in your organization will probably have a different perspective on that. And it's about understanding what are the actual things, what are the lowest hanging fruit for the things that are making the biggest impact to our delivery, and what's contributed to our past failures. So what are the things that we keep tripping on that we don't want to keep tripping on going forward? These all sound like obvious things to think about, but you'd be surprised how easy it is as you're in, like, especially if you're in a large organization and you're just in one team, it's really easy to lose sight of the bigger picture and the context that you're in. Organizational silos. So this is always something good to be aware of. You've probably heard phrases like, we need to break down the silos. You know, it's one of the most overused phrases in DevOps or Agile, but it's for good reason. It's a natural thing that happens as we start to hunker down into our teams. It's very easy to get an us versus them mentality, or just to kind of, not in a malicious way, but just kind of build out your own little world within the organization. So we need to be able to view that honestly, understand where the silos are, understand where conversations aren't happening that should be, and be able to address those accordingly. That's a pretty obvious thing for me to say that we should do, but the challenge is getting everybody to identify and agree upon those. So I think that's the step that we sometimes miss. It's one thing for our team to understand a silo or to identify a barrier in the organization, but we also need to be doing the legwork to get buy-in from the rest of the organization and our stakeholders to identify that, yes, this is a barrier in our organization, and we're going to address it as a team and as a group of people, as opposed to just being bitter about that barrier being there to begin with. And then the organizational agile culture. So we've kind of hammered this home already, but I just want to reiterate, you know, DevOps is an agile concept. It's born out of Agile. And so therefore, DevOps engineers are inherently Agilist. And that's a really important point, because you might be hard pressed to find a DevOps engineer who thinks about themselves as an Agilist. And that's naturally so, because we've kind of built out this exclusive language in our industry sometimes, where we think about Agilist as being people who are carrying titles like Scrum Master or Product Owner or what have you, or, you know, Scrum Coach or Agile Coach. Everybody on the Scrum team is an Agilist, obviously, but also DevOps engineers. And so for that reason, DevOps belongs in these kind of conversations that we're having around Agile, around our Agile processes, around our definitions of done and ready, or our planning, refinement, reviews, or whatever else we have. I mean, DevOps is Agile. It's part of Agile. So we should be acknowledging it in all of our Agile conversations, and vice versa. When we're talking about DevOps, Agile belongs there as well. And so after we understand the organization, it's really important that we understand the team. And so what do I mean by that? So a lot of times, as a DevOps engineer, you are going to be in service to an organization, but more often than not, you'll find yourself within the context of a team, maybe more than one team, but hopefully just one. But there's a lot of things that you can do as a DevOps engineer to help build that team up to execute better than it ever has before. So the first thing I like to think about are, what are the team dynamics? So every team is unique, just like every organization is unique. And so it doesn't do you any favors to go from team to team and always be thinking about them as the same thing. It's not just a code factory. It's people who are unique, and they bring unique skills and perspectives and personalities to their job. And it's contingent on you as a DevOps engineer to get to know those people, understand what makes them tick, understand their unique skills, and what you can be doing to help them execute better using those skills. You know, if they're passionate about something, you should be doing what you can to help channel that passion towards delivering value. And so there's a lot of things you can do that don't just empower an organization or a team, but individuals as well. I think that's something we often lose sight of. So healthy teams will naturally self-form around people's individuals' passions and skills. You know, if you have somebody who's very passionate about delivery, they might be the person who handles most of, you know, the automation around software delivery, or, you know, security or anything like that. So the DevOps engineer really needs to understand and how to apply those unique talents to the quality of the product they're delivering. So the team rhythms, what do I mean by this? So every team, especially after they start to kind of find their sea legs and self-form a little bit, they start to kind of build their own natural rhythms, whether they are intentionally acknowledging them or not. And a lot of times we're not going to be in the most mature environments where every line of code automatically gets pushed to production without any intervention from a developer or some sort of operations specialist. A lot of times in most organizations, it's going to be a little bit of a ceremony to get a deployment done. Obviously, our goal is to get away from that as much as possible, but pretending that it doesn't happen isn't going to do us any good either. So I like to think about what are these rhythms of how we're building value, developing value, and then deploying value, and how do we channel that in such a way that we're not interrupting that rhythm. So we're not constantly taking developers away from the work they need to accomplish for a sprint to handle a deployment or to solve a production issue. What are some ways that we can protect the sanctity of a sprint or an iteration for a team? So it's about understanding the team and understanding their culture and their potential and how to iterate towards that on a sprint by sprint basis. So team voices, this is a thing we talk a lot about, and when we talk about team structures, but we don't talk about it so much from a DevOps perspective. So, a lot of times it's hard to do, but we really want to fight for those flat team structures. So naturally, as humans, we want to build out hierarchies wherever we go, and that's just a natural instinct. But DevOps is about bringing people together, right? It's not about building out these barriers between people. But it's also not about diminishing anybody's capabilities as a senior member of the team. But the idea is that seniority can sometimes become a bottleneck. So we were talking a little bit before about rhythms and how we don't want to interrupt the team's rhythms, but that can happen pretty easily if there's one person on your team who has to respond to every production outage or has to do all of the deployments all the time. A DevOps engineer should be able to understand the team and help flatten the structure. And so that way, the people who might be more junior on the team might be more empowered to tackle on some of those issues that a senior member would normally do. If you take away nothing else, it's that DevOps should be a unifying force within your organization. That's the most important thing you want to think about is this idea of being a unifier. And then everything else should come naturally. If DevOps is building silos, if DevOps is making people feel excluded, then something is going wrong, and it might be time to take a step back and think about it a little more holistically. So what does a DevOps engineer do? We've already asked this question, but really the only valid answer to that at this point is all of that and automating where necessary. So automation is still a very big part of DevOps, and Insight can help you with that. But the takeaway from this is not to view it as only an automation skill, an automation practice. It's something that is much more deeply rooted within our Agile processes and within our teams. And it's about bringing our people together and unlocking their potential in the best way possible. So I really appreciate everybody's time today. I'm going to go ahead and switch over to questions if we have any. I was able to keep my promise about getting us out of here early, it looks like, but I'll defer to Angela if we have any questions or thoughts.
We do, and I've got two similar questions, so I'm going to state them both, and you can see how they overlap in your mind. If you were working with an organization that wanted to create or define their DevOps standards, where might you start? The question that I think is similar is, as a leader, how could I get started with DevOps?
Yeah, those are great questions. So DevOps standards are a very tough thing to define because DevOps is such a broad term, but it's something that helps. So I think the first thing you want to do is understand what your pain points are. So what is it that we've identified as going wrong that we're trying to implement a DevOps culture? I would personally keep it pretty simple at first. So accept it as an Agile practice, an Agile pursuit, and make sure that you're including your entire organization in that conversation. A lot of times it might be, instead of writing an extensive wiki or standards document, it might look like something like updating your definition ready or your definition of done, because those are the kind of things that your teams are interacting with on a regular basis. So, a lot of times the things we talk about with DevOps is having, a good testing strategy in place, automated testing and that kind of thing. So it might look at like, what are the things that we're actually considering when we're considering a work item to be done? So I would look for ways that you can, one, understand your pain points, and two, address those through natural agile processes if you have them. Otherwise, from there, it's really going to be dependent upon those specific pain points. But I think giving people a voice is the most important thing, and maybe have some brainstorming sessions with your team to understand their pain points. And I'm sorry, what was the other question again, Angela? There's where you get started.
So one was, yes, DevOps standards, and one was getting started.
Yeah, so that's a great question. And getting started is often tricky because there's no blanket answer to that, because it's going to mean different things to different people, and everybody has different challenges that they're trying to address. So for me, it would be about kind of like what I said already, but understanding the pain points, but also understanding what some of the guiding principles what some of the guiding principles are that you're trying to work towards. There's some great literature out there. If you've never read The Phoenix Project, that is a very good book. It is actually a fictional novel, but it is rooted in the idea of DevOps, and it presents it in a way that's a little easier to digest and isn't technology specific at all. And it kind of talks a little bit about kind of the lean manufacturing origins of DevOps. And so looking at that as like a fictional example actually helped me understand organizations that I was in a little bit better. How about you, Angela? Do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think what you've already called out too are the right places to start. And so I would just echo what you have referenced already, Tony. Total alignment with that.
And there is, if you want some more scholarly documentation out there, Atlassian, I referenced their DevOps survey earlier. They also have some great just kind of introductory documentation, and so does Microsoft for that matter. So I would encourage you to go check those out as well, because reading some of that might help you kind of think about it more in terms of your organization and how it applies there.
All right, Tony, a couple more questions if you're willing and able. All
Sure.
right. Another one. What are your key DevOps metrics?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I wish I had the formal names right in front of me, but there are a few key metrics that are good to think about. One is deployment frequency. I know we've talked a lot about that today, but that is, at the end of the day, a valid metric to be tracking. Other things are going to be like mean time to recovery. So what does it look like to how long is it normally taking to recover from an incident? One, it might be a sign, and if that number is going up, it might be a sign, one, that your testing isn't capturing everything that it could. It might be a sign that your monitoring isn't capturing things as quickly as possible. And it also might be a sign that there's some sort of manual intervention that's happening every time that you have to recover from something that's taking too long, or there's some churn and conversation and reaction times that we could address. Other are going to be I hope I'm using this term right, lead time. I always like to think about how long does it take to actually get it out there once we've identified it as something that we want to work on. Angela, did you have any other metrics that you had on your mind?
I think those are good. And just referring to lead time, I think that's from like the request from the customer until delivered. Yes, I think that's a great one.
Yeah. Thanks for defining that better than I did. Yeah.
No, you're fine. Cycle time is the nuance there, and it's slightly different for teams depending how they're defining it. So that's a good one. Okay, I'm going to hop to another question for you. What is your favorite tool that has enabled DevOps within a team or an organization?
Yeah, I want to be very careful how I answer that, because, obviously I'm sure everybody knows DevOps is not a specific tool. There are things you can do though that can be of benefit to your organization, and the answer largely depends on your organization. But I can answer from my own perspective with the huge caveat that may not be relevant to your organization at all. So the most important thing for me is having a way to have your backlog associated with the code very closely. So things like Azure DevOps or GitHub both allow you to do that. There's Jira tooling as well that you can use to, and Jira, even though it's more of a backlog management kind of thing, it also has lots of plugins and integrations with things like GitHub for having that relationship between your work items and your code, where like actually every time you do a pull request into your main branch of your code, I don't want to get too technical here, but every time you do a pull request, you can have it actually associated with a specific work item. And I think that's very valuable. When you're looking for tooling, I'm looking for things that are tying my actual like requirements and my metrics and my backlog to the actual code that's getting committed, so that people who are looking at code history, when they see, okay, this change introduced a new error in our system, why did we make that change to begin with? It's pretty easy to go back and actually see what the specific request was that it was associated with. So those are very valuable. A lot of times, a lot of DevOps things are going to be very source control related. In the industry, most people are using Git. There are certainly other source control solutions out there, but Git is definitely by and far the leader out there. So I think having a good understanding of Git and source control in general is going to be almost a requirement for DevOps to be able to know how to handle different kinds of branching strategies. And there's a bunch of different ones out there that are going to vary depending on teams and maturity and that kind of thing.
Awesome, Tony. And I can relate to that from a transparency perspective. Making things visible, making things simplified. Yeah. And those are some of the tools, I guess, to leverage with people to achieve those goals. Awesome. Cool. How you doing on time? Do you want one more, or are you feeling?
I'm fine on time. If we have more questions,
right,
I want to address them.
We'll add one more in for you, and then I think we'll wrap up. This question is, what is the primary key success factor to acquire, to leverage from a DevOps technology stack perspective?
Can you say it one more time? Sorry.
I
just want to make sure yeah.
What is the primary key success factor to acquire or to leverage from a DevOps technology stack perspective? I can't speak, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So I hope I answer this the right way that the person who's asking the question. But for me, the factors tie back to that initial definition of DevOps. So unifying people, processes, and products to deliver value, right? So even though I harped on the fact that we don't want to get overly obsessive about production deployment frequency, I think having some sort of frequency is going to be one of your indicators that something is going right. So a lot of times what you'll see is if we're always reliant on manual ad hoc releases, there won't be an even cadence of when those releases are happening. There might be a cadence for a little bit, but it'll probably start to drop off. And it'll be sporadic if there's lots of things going on. So I think having a frequent release to production, even if it's not a million times a day like Netflix, is at least a good indicator to you that we have a good automated cadence in place. And then a lot of those from your, like, since DevOps is rooted in Agile, I think, there'd probably be a lot of things you could inspect about, are we actually getting through things on our backlog and that kind of thing too. I think that's about the best way I can answer that off the cuff.
Very good. I think we've got all the questions, so appreciate it.
Okay, great. Angela, I really appreciate you taking the time to handle the Q&A there and provide your thoughts. And I really appreciate everybody's attendance today. And I think at this point, are we going to turn it back over to Taylor, or are we going to close it out from here?
Thanks. Yeah, that concludes today's webinar. Thanks for presenting, and thanks attendees for the opportunity to present to you.
Thank you so much.